everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. South Korea is doing all it can to tame inflation, but with little signs of any progress. Consumer prices have been on a downtrend earlier this year, but starting in August, they started to accelerate again, jumping to 3.8% in October. Such inflation is even causing businesses to adopt the tactics called shrinkflation or skimflation, reducing size or quality while maintaining their prices. Such untamed inflation in South Korea is quite the contrast to the U.S. and Europe, where consumer prices are cooling down. Why is South Korea having such difficulty when it comes to containing inflation? And what decisions are the central bank expected to make against this backdrop? For this, we invited Professor Song Soo-young from Chung-Ang University. Professor Song, welcome.
Yeah, good evening to you.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good evening. And we also have Professor Greg Butchak from Stanford University. Good to have you with us, Professor Butchak.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Now, let's first talk about South Korea's inflation. Professor Song, it stayed above 3% for the third consecutive month in October, rising 3.8% on year. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah, recently there is a little bit surge because of some war-related some temporary problem. I believe it must be a transitory between the Israel and the Palestine war. However, still, according to the IMF, the projection of Korean inflation rate for the end of this year is going to be 3.4% or 3.4%. So I think the inflation, because of in China, the inflation rate has only a 0.7% is projected to be at the end of the year 2023. But in Europe, several countries may suffer from some high inflation rate. Clearly, headline inflation is declining over time. And the U.S. also declining in the last October dramatically, the very low inflation rate relatively. So to that regard, what matters, what is of concern, and what is important is not just the inflation, but is our economic growth rate, because we have a serious problem with the economic growth rate.
All right, I see. Well, Professor Song, you have already mentioned the IMF's forecast, and it suggested that this year's inflation will be 3.6%, while next year's is likely to be 2.4%. Though it is expected to reach the target of 2% by late next year, this is much slower than expected, right?
Oh, I don't think so, because clearly, because in last year and the year ago, in the year 2022, there is a very critical paper has been published, and it says the U.S. economy may need some 6% unemployment rate and persistent inflation rate for the next 4 or 5 years. And also, Larry Summers has mentioned that kind of some very difficult situation caused by the persistent inflation. However, we have seen that inflation turns out to be very transitory and temporary one. Clearly, there is some indicator of the declining inflation, even in last year, according to some house price and the owner's equivalent rent has been, because it has some tendency to maintain, because once the contract is made, and then its effect has some persistent effect on the price. Therefore, clearly there is a possibility of the inflation should decline over time. However, it was denied, and then Larry Summers and the other economists argued that we may need a very persistent high level of interest rate, but it is not anymore true right now.
All right, I see your point. Well, what is true is that we are suffering from the ongoing inflation right now. And Professor Butchak, companies have been implementing business tactics such as shrinkflation and skimflation. What are they, and are there any related laws or systems that can prevent this?
Sure. So inflation that we've been talking about is when prices for the same item increase. Shrinkflation is kind of a cute name for something similar, which is companies keep prices the same, but they save costs by reducing the quality or the quantity of the item. Ultimately, this kind of has the same economic cause and effect as inflation, but it takes a different form and it's sometimes harder to notice. So let me give you kind of a funny example of this. I think you probably know Oreo cookies. They're like the two chocolate cookies with cream filling in the middle. So some people in the US lately have claimed that they've shrunk the amount of cream filling that they put between the two cookies. So I actually like the chocolate part better, so I'm okay with that. But this kind of like less cream in your Oreos is a perfect example of shrinkflation. Instead of raising the price of the cookie, they give a kind of sneakily less cookie for the same price. Now, like clearly this is something that's much easier to do with some goods than others. You can kind of reduce how much snack you put in the snack bag, but it's illegal to outright lie about what you're selling. So you can't say that you're selling someone 1 liter of gasoline, but then only give them 0.9 liters. That'd be illegal, but there's no law that says, Oreos have to be the same every year. So it's really up to consumers to sort of look at what they're buying and notice what's going on. The thing with shrinkflation is quality is going down. So what that means is the quality adjusted price is increasing. That's just another form of inflation. Prices are going up for the same thing you get. And when economists calculate inflation for official statistics, they're not totally naive about this. They do their best to take these changes in quality into account. So shrinkflation does, at least in theory, show up in official measures, although things like Oreo cookie filling quantity decreasing, these are subtle things that are probably missed in a lot of official measures.
All right, I see. Well, thank you, Professor Butchuk, for kindly explaining what shrinkflation and skimflation are. Now, Professor Song, the government is not only trying to clamp down on those prevalent business tactics, but also it launched task forces under several ministries to monitor the prices of key food and other major items. But some say these will not be that effective. What is your view on this, and what additional measures should be put in place?
Yeah, the price control is always, according to the traditional economics perspective, it is a bad idea. And but however, there is no rule but except there is no exception but rule. There is no rule but exception. I'm sorry about that. So it means that some price control would be effective to cool down the inflation. So historically, as early as 1947, under the Truman administration in the U.S., the government has adopted some kind of price control because at that time was a transition period from the some military industry because of the war has been taking place for the past 5 years in the World War II. Then the U.S. economy needs adjust and reallocation of the resources for the production of consumer goods. Therefore, it needs some time, and the hysteresis plays a role, and the lag always out there. Therefore, as long as this turns out to be a temporary and transitory price inflation, then government temporary control, restraint of the price increase, because the sellers, they would like to take advantage or exploit the opportunity to earn more profit through the price gouging. As a result, the government control would be effective. Right now in Korea, the problem is, as I mentioned earlier, the growth rate is low and the domestic economy is very bad. So in that situation, just a simple price control to be effective, it should be only applied in the limited point of time until just 3 months or 4 months or something like that. And then the government should make some other steps to reinvigorate the economic growth rate and return to some normal situation, because this is a very, to me, it sounds like a Korean economy is very abnormal right now.
Right, I see. So the price control should be applied only for a limited amount of time because the local economy is right now quite in a serious situation. I understand your point. Now, until now, South Korea is struggling to contain. We have been talking about how South Korea is struggling to, contain the inflation. But let's turn our eyes to other major economies. And so, Professor Buchak, the U.S. Consumer Price Index slowed to 3.2% last month, its coolest rate since July. And Eurozone inflation also fell below 3%. Could you tell us more about what led to this fall in inflation?
Sure. So the big driver of reduced inflation in the U.S., and I think this is also true in the Eurozone as well, has been the decline in energy prices, so natural gas and oil. These prices, they tend to be super volatile due to kind of constant supply shifts and demand shifts in the global economy. So as Professor Song mentioned, on the supply side, there were these worries about supply disruptions due to conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. So far, these disruptions haven't really materialized in a really persistent way, disrupting the supply of oil. On the demand side, energy prices, they sort of just tend to follow economic growth. So if there's more economic activity, you just need more energy to do it. And global economic growth has been a little bit slower than a lot of people expected, particularly outside of the US. So you put together kind of relatively good news on the supply side, fewer disruptions that were expected, with less demand globally, and that just sort of causes energy prices to grow more slowly. And that's contributed to lower inflation in the US. One thing I should mention going forward is because energy prices are so volatile and they're often moving up and down for reasons outside of the Fed's control, the Fed is often paying attention to an inflation measure that excludes food and energy. You may have heard of this. It's called the core CPI. And that number is actually still a little bit higher. It's around 4%. And what's keeping that number high in the U.S. is mostly housing costs, actually. So there's a lot to say about that, but kind of long story short, there's a big housing shortage in the U.S., particularly in cities where people really want to live, like New York or San Francisco. And unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, that's mostly outside of the Fed's control, and that problem is kind of unlikely to resolve itself soon.
All right, I see. So I understand that core inflation is still high and we need to consider that factor. But Professor Song, Washington's slowing consumer prices in October are quite reinforcing the sentiment that the U.S. economy is set to enter a Goldilocks period with moderate growth and low inflation. How do you see the U.S. economy right now?
Yeah, overall evaluation of the U.S. economy performance is they have succeeded in achieving the soft landing because traditionally very hard landing or so without any very high level of interest rate or similar economic conditions such as recess, only those recess similar condition could make the inflation to cool down. But however, successfully and fortunately, this inflation has been declining. And Professor Buchak has already mentioned several countries, but what I would like to say in Europe, for example, United Kingdom is its projected growth rate is, let me see, yeah, it's 0.5% right now here in this year. And whereas the projected consumer price in 2023 is 7.7%. So whereas in Germany is a negative 0.5 percentage point growth rate. And then the CPI is expected to be at the end of the year 2023 is 6.3%. So that means the European countries suffered so much from such very severe stagflation. So, however, the U.S. is amazing because their performance is projected growth rate is 2.1%, whereas the projected consumer price only 4.1%. So the growth rate is real growth rate. So nominal growth rate is much higher. And then when I look at some other, such as, for example, Japan's projected real GDP growth rate is 2 percentage points. It's surprise, much better than South Korea. And these two biggest economies has performed, and real growth rate is has reached the 2% point. Considering the size of total GDP, this is a huge achievement. And the consumer price for Japan is 3.2%. This is very good news for the Japan because Japan has suffered so much from the deflation rather than inflation. So therefore, considering this situation, and another one is the People's Republic of China. Even though we have seen there is a problem with the Chinese economy, but real growth rate is still, they have reached a 5 percentage point for the year 2023, whereas the problem in China is deflation. Inflation is only 0.7%. So if they go this way, in China's economy might suffer so much from the deflation situation. So in order to break out this trap, the Chinese government needs some very expansionary policy, and also they want to some normalize trade relationship with the United States. And the United States also, they would like to make some hospitable relationship with China because in year 2024, the U.S. economy is projected growth rate is declined very much because they have performed too good to maintain. So that is the current world situation right now.
I see. Now, I understand that several countries are showing economic resilience, as our Professor Song said. But Professor Butchak, after some time, many expect the U.S. economy to be weakened and the Fed to cut interest rates by as much as 275 basis points in 2024. When do you think the pivot will come, and to what extent? All right, it seems that we are seeing technical glitches. And so, Professor Butchak, I will come to you later. Professor Song, do you mind answering the question for me?
Oh, sure. Would you say again, please, briefly?
Very briefly.
Yeah. Would you say again the question?
Yes.
Because I didn't pay attention to the question.
All right. So I understand that several countries are seeing economic resilience, but many expect the U.S. economy to be weakened after some time and the Fed to cut interest rates by as much as 275 basis points in 2024. When do you think the pivot will come, and to what extent?
Because the current world economic outlook is very mixing. I mean, because even some countries clearly show the resilience, particularly in the African countries and developing countries. The problem is developed countries, particularly European countries, suffered so much. So to that regard, I would like to see the recent development in South America, Brazil. Brazil has their projected real GDP is 3.1% for 2023, and they may continue this kind of some very sustainable resilience of the economy. Whereas their consumer price inflation is expected to be 4.7% and remains so at that level. So as you look around, the Chinese economy, even though they have shown some substantial growth rate, 5%, but their inflation is too low. So this cannot be sustained because in order to support or bolster the growth rate, some level of inflation is necessary. But we have no idea, there is no such a golden rule for the best inflation rate because 2% is happened to be chosen by some New Zealand economist. I can't remember his name, but this is just an accidental choice. So it means that what is the very optimal or the best level of inflation? That's up to the country, the specific surroundings and the conditions and the economic stage. Therefore, we have to clearly, that is clearly shown in the recent speech by the IMF economist Gopinath. What she has mentioned is the challenging issue is that different countries should have some tailor-made their own fiscal policy and monetary policy because each country, different sectors, different industry have different problems. Therefore, we cannot have some unilateral some steps to take care or to cure all the problems. So as you see, the different level of inflation persists around the world in the differently and the different growth rate. Therefore, each country may need different, some specific, their own tailor-made policy.
All right, I cannot agree more. Now, Professor Buchak, one thing for sure is that we are seeing the reversal of the inflation rate between South Korea and the United States happening for the first time in more than 6 years. Is this going to have any impact on the South Korean economy?
Yeah, sorry for dropping off. I guess we have some shrinkflation on Zoom here. So I think that the South Korean and U.S. numbers are actually very close. I wouldn't read too much into these small differences. And if you sort of put these latest numbers aside, which are really pretty modest increases, I think the good news is that South Korea has had relatively low and very stable rate of inflation for a really long time. I would actually totally agree with what Professor Song said earlier. What's really striking to me more than inflation in Korea is this very unusual combination that's forecast by the IMF of very low unemployment paired with very low growth. So unemployment, the unemployment rate in South Korea is about 2%. And as I mentioned, the U.S. Unemployment rate is about 4%. That people, if you ask people in the U.S., they'll look at that 4% number and say, well, that's great, that's full employment. So why do we think like 4% is full employment and not 0%? The answer is that in sort of a growing normal economy, there's a lot of turnover. You know, new businesses are started, old ones close, employment turns over, people search for new and better jobs. Think of like the drama going on at OpenAI. In an economy like that, you expect some natural rate of unemployment that reflects this kind of healthy creative process. But then when you see numbers far below that, without significant inflation, like what's forecast in Korea, you might think of that as a sign of some sort of stagnation or things being a little bit too stable. There's not enough of this so-called creative disruption. So amazingly, you know, like South Korea's unemployment rate has only been above 4% for a few months out of the past 20 years. So on one hand, that's remarkable stability. That's a great thing. But on the other hand, as that number drifts towards 1% as the IMF forecasts, you might wonder if there's some sort of lack of business dynamism going on. So, you know, if I were the policymaker, I wouldn't be so worried about sort of short-term or medium-term inflation. I'd be more worried about that lack of growth over the longer term.
All right, I see your point, Professor Buchak. Now, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to Professor Song. The Bank of Korea will have a rate-setting meeting at the end of this month, and based on the discussion we have had up until now, what do you think the central bank's decision will be?
Currently, the chairman of Bank of Korea, Chairman Lee, has, I think he put too much weight on the inflation rate, because as you see, our inflation rate is not any more concern, I believe. And the problem is, therefore, I would like to suggest considering some decrease of the interest rate to bolster some the economic growth rate. Also, what is important, the fiscal policy is necessary, but because of considering some general election, which will be held next year, March or April. So that is, that could be some kind of, it could be used as some foundation on which the fiscal policy is expanded, or that could be some moment or point where the Korean economy has suffered. So Professor Buchak has mentioned the low unemployment rate of South Korea is very promising. Yeah, I agree with that. But however, looking into details, then the South Koreans are the workers, they are forced to work longer because their pension, the moment of pension receiving has been delayed. Therefore, to that regard, as long as the working people and the low unemployment rate is very good for the economy, however, the inequality of the income and wealth has been diverged further. So that is a kind of dilemma of the Korean economy.
All right, I see. So our Professor Song's words were that we need to focus more on growth rather than inflation right now. I see your point, Professor. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Song and Professor Butchak, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, and good evening to you and Mr. Butchak.
Thank you, Professor. All right. That's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.